Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Janabalabha Giri Bharadari. Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Banachari. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada Jaya, Prabhupada Jaya, Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad, Paramhamsa Parivadikacharya, To Tadasata Shri Śrimad, Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki, Grantaraj Śrimad Bhāgavatam Ki, Samveda Bhaktivinoda Ki, Gaura Premanandi. All glories to Simla devotees, all glories to Simla devotees. All glories to Simla devotees, all glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. David Aminar, could you rotate the camera a little bit clockwise if you're looking down on the top of it? Yeah, that's better. Yeah, closer too. Just, I'm trying to get that black edge out. That's good. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakhaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamhyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Scha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragunatanbitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaur Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so we are on Canto 3, Chapter 17. Wow. Yeah, right. Canto 3, Chapter 17, Text 1. We're starting a new chapter today. And the chapter is entitled Hiranyaksha Conquers the Universe, right, or something like that. Yeah. More or less. Okay. So here is our verse. Maitreya Uvacha Nishamyatma Bhutva Gitang Nishamyatma Bhutva Gitang Karanang Sankayojitaha Karanang Sankayojitaha Tata Sarve Nivartanta Tata Sarve Nivartanta Tridivaya Divyaukasha Tridivaya Divaukasha Maitreya Uvacha Nishamyatma Bhutva Gitang Karanang Sankayojitaha Tata sarve nivartanta Tridivaya divokasha Maitreya uvacha Nishamyatma bhutvagitam Karanam sankayojitaha Tata sarve nivartanta Tridivaya divokasha Maitreya uvacha Nishamyatma bhutvagitam Karanam sankayojitaha Tata sarve nivartanta Tridivaya divokashaha Maitreya uvacha Nishamyatma bhutvagitam Karanam sankayojitaha Tata sarve nivartanta Tidivaya trivokasha Maitreya uvacha Nishamyatma bhutvagitam Karanam sankayojitaha Tata sarve nivartanta Tridivaya divokashaha Maitreya uvacha Nishamyatma bhutvagitam Karanam sankayojitaha Tata sarve nivartanta Tridivaya divokasha Maitreya, the sage Maitreya, Uvacha said, Nishamya, upon hearing, Atma Bhutva, by Brahma, Gitam, explanation, Karanam, the cause, Shankaya, from fear, Ujitaha, freed, Tataha, then, Sarve, all, Nivartantam, returned, Tridivaya, to the heavenly planets, Divya Okashaha, the demigods who inhabit the higher planets. Sri Maitreya said, the demigods, the inhabitants of the higher planets, were freed from all fear upon hearing the cause of the darkness explained by Brahma, who was born from Vishnu. Thus they all returned to their respective planets. So, responsively, Sri Maitreya said, the demigods, the inhabitants of the higher planets, were freed from all fear upon hearing the cause of the darkness explained by Brahma, who was born from Vishnu. Thus they all returned to their respective planets. So here is the purport by Srila Prabhupada. The demigods, who are denizens of the higher planets, are also very much afraid of incidents such as the universe is becoming dark. And so they consulted Brahma. This indicates that the quality of fear exists for every living entity in the material world. The four principal activities of material existence are eating, sleeping, fearing, and mating. The fear element exists also in the demigods. On every planet, even in the higher planetary systems, including the moon and the sun, as well as on this earth. The same principle of animal life exists. Otherwise, why are the demigods also afraid of the darkness? The difference between demigods and ordinary human beings is that the demigods approach authority, whereas the inhabitants of this earth defy authority. If people would only approach the authority, then every adverse condition in the universe could be rectified. Arjuna was also disturbed on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, but he approached the authority, Krishna, and his problem was solved. The conclusive instruction of this incident is that we may be disturbed by some material condition, but if we approach the authority who can actually explain the matter, then our problem is solved. The demigods approached Brahma for the meaning of the disturbance, and after hearing from him, they were satisfied and returned home peacefully. Maitreya uvacha nishanyatma bhutva gitang karanam sankayojitaha tata sarve nivartanta tridivaya divaukashaha. Sri Maitreya said, the demigods, the inhabitants of the higher planets, were freed from all fear upon hearing the cause of the darkness explained by Brahma, who was born from Vishnu. Thus they all returned to their respective planets. To kind of recapitulate and focus on where we are in this story and how we got to this point, immediately we can see that the demigods were disturbed by the growth of the embryo in the womb of Diti, which was spreading darkness everywhere. And so they approached Brahma to try to mitigate their fears, and Brahma explained that this was the seed of Kasyapa, which was the two gatekeepers, Jai and Vijay, and that two very great demons would be born, and Vishnu would come himself to dispatch these demons. And of course, that's what will happen in the next chapter. This whole section really goes from basically about chapter 13 to chapter 18. If we go all the way back to chapter 13, where first we hear about this battle between Hiranyaksha and Varahadev, that's where we lead up to this story. At that point, we just have a brief overview of the story of how Vishnu, in the form of Varahadev, will kill Hiranyaksha. And then now we're going to hear the details of what led up to that, how Hiranyaksha was challenging everybody, and eventually he will challenge Varuna, the demigod in charge of the waters, and Varuna will not fight him, but suggest instead that he fight Vishnu, and then Hiranyaksha will make a search to find Vishnu, and eventually in the form of Varahadev, he will actually meet Vishnu, and that will be the end of his life. So it will come to be like that. So we find that here in Hiranyakashipu is considered the older of the two brothers, and he was born in the sense he came out of the womb second, which means that he was the one conceived first. At least that's the way it's described in Śrimad Bhāgavatam. We also find out that Hiranyakashipu, in one sense, was the more powerful of the two, but of course both of them were very powerful. And Hiranyakashipu had subjugated the entire universe. He was the controller of all three planetary systems, and because of his great demoniac mentality, he forbade any kind of spiritual practices. In fact, during the reign of Hiranyakashipu, people did not even say Narayanaya Namaha to each other. They said Hiranyaka Namaha. So they had to use his name. He was such a tyrant. And this is the nature of those who want to impose their own ideas on the world. Now, materialistic people, they reject the rule and the existence of God. So naturally, they reject both the not only rule and existence, but the various values and methods that God gives for people to live. And instead, they want to establish their own methods and their own values. And pretty much our Western society has moved further and further in that direction. And this is not surprising. That's what we would expect in Kali Yuga, that things would become more and more atheistic and materialistic, and they certainly have become that way. There was a general understanding that humans now are the basis of all ethics, morality, and essentially the measure of all. There's this idea man is the measure of all. So man is the measure of all when one does not consider God. That's how it works. Friedrich Nietzsche made the famous statement that God is dead. But what he was referring to was that humans now no longer believe in God. So therefore, with God missing, there's a big vacuum. And he was very correct in that. But he felt that that vacuum could be filled by humans creating their own reason for why they exist and why they do things. And from that point onward, in general, the philosophical mood of the world, the zeitgeist, started to go very much further in the direction of people just concocting some kind of philosophy, concocting some kind of value system or ethics, and just thinking, well, nobody's going to tell me that that isn't what I want to do. No one has challenged me. So therefore, this is it. This is what's going to be the new ethics. And so we saw the rise of great epic and failed totalitarian systems. You know, we had the communist system and we had the system of the Nazis. Both of those systems were very oriented towards this Nietzschean idea that now man is the measure of everything. And so both of them wanted to impose their understanding on the entire world. They felt that no one had the right to challenge them unless they were stronger, and they felt strong enough, just like we see here in Yaksha, feels very strong. And when you feel very strong, you are the one that makes the rules, because we are not thinking about God. So therefore, if I'm strong enough, I make the rules. And that's what Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha did. And of course, that's what our modern would-be world conquerors would also do. The human mind needs something to root itself in, something to base itself on, no matter what philosophy you adopt. There has to be some solid concept that you can place your mental feet on to feel that you're standing on solid ground. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, our material world is conceptually like a big swamp that there's no solid ground, really. And whatever philosophy you accept, you're forced to deal with things that you can't explain and you don't understand. And that's the way that the material world is. We know some things, and other things we can't explain. And if we follow the history of philosophy, especially our Western philosophy, we see many philosophers trying to rise to the platform of explaining some of these things, and then failing to be able to make the ends meet. This is the way that philosophy has fallen short. In the days before Greek philosophy, the philosophy of the world was based on some type of religious formula, based on some kind of knowledge of a supreme something or another. You know, in some cases, there were some group of various demigod or demigod figures. Of course, in India we have the demigods, and the Greeks worshiped demigods, the Egyptians worshiped demigods, and we had, even in the Americas at that time, the peoples of America, the natives, they worshiped various demigods. In Polynesian islands, they had demigods. Everyone had this knowledge that there was someone powerful that controlled the air, someone powerful that controlled the storms, etc., controlling the sun. There were a few odd things going on in the world, like in Mesopotamia, where you had another group of people that were worshipped by those at that time that didn't appear to be the same group of people as the demigods that were familiar most of the rest of the world over. So a different group of people. But nonetheless, there was this idea that there was some codes and they were given and people followed them. There was some priestly class who gave those codes and people followed them. And there were a lot of prescriptions for how things should be purified and why they should be, etc., etc. And then, of course, with the start of Western philosophy with the Greeks, we start to descend into essentially what begins to become modern materialism. The Greeks, at least the pre-Socratics, were the first to create something we call naturalism. They were very interested. Of course, they weren't really the first, but they're the ones that we pay attention to because they and the people who listened to what they had to say made ideas that today exist even in our modern world. These ideas haven't gone away. They were brought up a long, long time ago. And people may not have studied them in college or may not have studied them in any kind of capacity, in reading or whatever. But your everyday person walking around on the street has these ideas in their mind, because these ideas are said by philosophers and then by people in the media. These ideas are held in general by people who have heard them from their teachers, from their friends, from their parents, or whatever. So these ideas exist in our modern world. And these ideas have consequences, and these ideas have been thought and talked about and disputed for many years. So a person does not have to take a philosophy course to have come into contact with these various ideas. And if you haven't taken a philosophy course, then likely you are also unaware of where some of these ideas came from and what they lead to. That's the important thing, you know. These ideas come from somewhere and they lead to somewhere. And they've had drastic consequences on planet Earth, you know. The communist theory from Marx is actually not a political system, it's an economic system, but it needed a political system, and so that political system was created. And then that political system created hell on earth, not just once, but on a number of different occasions in different cultures. So this is the outgrowth of philosophies that decide that God doesn't need to be a part of the philosophy. That's not to say that there are cultures who decided that God does need to be a part of the philosophy and also created similar and horrible situations. That's also there. To be able to communicate with people of our world, people who are around us in various places, to be able to communicate with them, to some extent we have to understand how they think and why they think what they think. The most common thing that I think is important to recognize is, I've said this a number of times, that most modern philosophy is bottom up. Our philosophy is top down. And most religiously oriented philosophy is top down, and most materialistic philosophy is bottom up. So in other words, we believe that the first thing that existed is a supreme intelligence, and we don't have to justify why all kinds of intelligent and integrated systems exist, because there was a creator. And a creator has the ability to think of how things go together and make various interlocking systems which need to function in a very specific way. And everywhere we look in our material world, science just finds more and more and more examples of intricate systems interacting in very complex ways and creating a kind of stability and a kind of order in the world around us. So we don't say that this happened as according to some kind of naturalistic or bottom-up primitive things bumping together and creating complex structure. We say instead that there was an original consciousness, and that original consciousness was able to organize and make things in the way that they are. And so when we see purposeful action happening in the world by the material world in general, that there's a reason why it works that way. There was intelligence that thought it out. And we also say that the physical world, which works according to certain very limited properties, this physical world is created from another world, the spiritual world, and in the very beginning, as it interfaces, as we have the Pradhan and then the Mahatat, this Pradhan and Mahatat become more and more limited, more and more specific in the way that it functions, and therefore the lockstep highly intricate way the material world works, its dynamics. The scientists study these dynamics. These interlocking ways are just impositions on an energy that doesn't necessarily have to work that way. So we don't have to explain how things work in such a complex way. It's just the limitations placed upon the material world and its energies by the Supreme. He can lift them if he wants to, and sometimes he does that, or he can let them operate the way they usually work. And this is exactly what science studies. Philosophy is actually, originally, it was the thinking about thinking, the big questions. Why are we here? What's the best way to live? What is this world that we find ourselves born into? It's those kind of questions. And of course, over many years, humans have asked those questions in Western society and come up with certain answers. And a few places along the line, humans were able to systematically study certain phenomenon in the world around us, just certain phenomenon. And those phenomenon were able to be codified, replicated. Those phenomena were able to be described with mathematics, and because they were reproducible and describable, then those turned into what we now call sciences. But there were things that didn't turn out that way. Only some things from a philosophical perspective wound up making the transformation into what today we call sciences. That if you really look at it, there were chemistry. You know, people wondered, what is this matter that we're enmeshed in? How does it work? So eventually it was possible to study how various substances interact with one another, and to do that in such a systematic way that today we have chemistry. Then we were able to study, how forces bounce around in the material world when we have moving objects. How do they interrelate with one another? How does something move through the air? How does something roll? How does something flow in the water? And these all became sciences. And one thing we can always recognize is that when something is actually a science, then that means that we're able to control it and study it. When something is not controllable, then it doesn't really classify as a science. It becomes much, much more speculative. So, for instance, meteorology, we can't control the weather. We can kind of study what it does, and it's a very approximate science. When we get into psychology, we can't control what people think or even directly measure how they think or what they think. So it's a very speculative science. We can talk about how atoms of oxygen and atoms of hydrogen come together to form water, but we can't explain how the universe started because we didn't see it. There was no television cameras rolling at the time, unfortunately, so we don't know how it started, but we can build up theories. So this is all speculative. We have, as we've been saying, a top-down, not a bottom-up. And that's why Darwinism and this theory of evolution is so important to materialists, especially atheist materialists, because it gives them this hope that somehow or other very simple things can knock together and create more complex things. And if we can accept the idea that very simple things can knock together to create more complex things, then why not accept the idea that more complex things can knock together and create even more complex things? So we're building a universe from the bottom up. In general, we see that this is not our experience in the everyday world, that you have complex things, and instead of building themselves up, usually complex things disintegrate. If you leave an automobile out in the rain and you don't drive it for, years and years and years, it doesn't bump together to create a better automobile. Instead, it kind of turns into a rusting hunk of junk after a short time. And this is an idea the scientists know well. It's called entropy, that things kind of disintegrate as things go on. So not only is there this dichotomy between a bottom-up and a top-down universe, which is the difference between our philosophy or the Vedic viewpoint, and much to the same extent other religious viewpoints, there's also the difference between how things started. Some philosophies claim that things started from matter. There's basically three possibilities. One of them is that things always existed the way they are, so there's no need to talk about how they started. Another thing is that things are gradually evolving from a particular point, or we have the Vedic conception, which things are cyclical, that things start, they go on for some time, then they dwindle and collapse, and then they start again. So that's the Vedic system. There is also this point that I was making before, that we say there's an intelligence behind everything. So therefore, there is a person organizing things. From the atheist and materialistic perspective, this becomes the rules of physics, which they feel they actually worship them the way that we worship the Supreme Lord. They feel that these rules are the way that they are. They've always been this way, and they can never change under any circumstances. So this is the nature of the atheist materialistic outlook on things that we have. Just perpetual rules, and we don't have to ask how they came to be. Somehow they're there. And if we just explore the future by applying these rules, we will understand how things will come about. We can explain everything this way. Again, the material world is like a philosophical swamp. So devotees and those who are theistic, they base themselves ultimately on the Supreme, on God, in some way, shape, or fashion. Those who are not devotees, they base themselves on these ideas or these principles, these scientific principles, which to them are completely inviolable, that they feel that these things are how we explain everything. So if you have an explanation and it has mathematics and it has various physical and material formulas in it, then that's acceptable. However, if you have an explanation and it talks about the Supreme Lord and various energies, that's not acceptable, at least in the modern way of thinking. So this is what counts as an explanation. What's there too is among those who have some notion of God, and this is described in the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. We have this idea that we have what Prabhupada calls the Mahatmas, those who worship the Supreme Lord, and they engage in this service, and they're always chanting. So that's there in the 9th chapter. But then you have 9:15, where we discuss that there is actually, well, before we get into that level, there's another group which are called the Sukratinas, which are mentioned in chapter 7 of Bhagavad Gita. The Sukratinas are those who are the inquisitive, the desire of wealth, the one in distress, and the jnani. So these are the 4 kinds of Sukratinas. These are people who believe in some kind of organizing force in the universe, and they tend to feel it's a being of some kind or another. So those who are approaching God for relief of their suffering. So there's an idea that there's a being who has intelligence and he can be approached. Then you have those who are approaching God for wealth. Again, the same idea there. Then you have those who are inquisitive. Well, what's the nature of this being? And finally, those who are jnanis, who have deeper knowledge. So these are other levels of understanding of the Supreme. Now, below them, in 915, we have the 3 other categories, which are the Ekatvena, the one who believes that the Supreme is some kind of one thing. Usually we call this impersonalism. One that believes that the Supreme is somehow the Brahman. Then we have the Bahuda, the Ekatvena, Pritakvena Bahuda. The Pritakvena Bahuda is the person who believes either many gods or believes in some concocted thing running the universe. And then below that, we have the Vishvatamuk, which is the person who believes the universe is God, which is kind of what we call pantheism. So these are various conceptions of God, but they're all conceptions of God. These are kind of above the platform of atheism, where your conception of God is it's a bad idea. That's what your conception of God is, you know. So these are different ways people view the universe, and depending on your completeness of your understanding of God is how well you'll be able to explain things and how much you'll be able to please the Supreme. For if you don't have a very good concept of the Supreme, you won't be able to please him very well. You'll actually, you may actually displease the Supreme Lord. And of course, if you're an atheist, you're not even interested in pleasing him. So these are various conceptions. We live in a world where all kinds of people have all kinds of conceptions. And when we're discussing with people, it's, I think, important to get a sense of what their view of things is. In most cases, people don't have a very deep philosophy. Their philosophy is just a few sort of scattered, what you might call, few scattered shibboleths or few scattered truisms, and that's about as far as it goes. But sometimes people have a more evolved philosophy. They've actually thought about it. So in the long run, maybe not across the prasadam table from somebody at the Sunday program, but Krishna consciousness will be spotlighted to have to answer questions that scientists and atheists and people who are, in academia, those questions that they challenge. So in doing that, we have to, somebody has to learn how to be able to take those questions and think about them and reply to them, not in an obviously overtly dogmatic way, but in a way that is reasonable, where we can explain this is what you believe, and even from a Western philosophical point of view, this belief has its problems. But we have a different concept, and this is what the Vedic concept is. Have you ever thought of that? So in this way, I think that we will be able, we won't win all the battles because some people are convinced of a particular philosophy and they're not going to change. But others may be won over if we can present what we need to say in a way that's reasonable and shows we haven't been living under a rock or never come into contact with Western philosophy at any time in our lives. All of us basically, even if you're from India, grew up with a Western philosophical slant, even if you don't know it. As I was saying before, your teachers, your parents, the society you grow up in has certain values, understandings, certain things it takes as legitimate, certain things that don't need to be proved when you say them in a circle of human beings. Other things which, if you say them, you have to definitely show some evidence for because other people don't believe them. Okay, so I want to leave some time for questions and response, if there are any. Any questions or comments?
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have a question pertaining to the last point that you made, that sooner or later we'll have to face and we'll have to be in a discussion and explain the points. But I'm interested, how far can we go into adopting to the current event structure? Here, let me give you an example. Bhaktivinoda Thakur in Krishna Samhita, he writes a few things that are obvious that he wrote them just to kind of cater to the public, to get them to step forward from the a Bhāgavatam way. The Bhāgavatam explains the events, and then basically he explains it, right? How he explains the events as pertaining everything happened on the earth and everything.
Everything.
As if everything has happened on this earth. There's no other planets, nothing. He writes that kind of canva, and then he goes deeper into the philosophy of, internal philosophy of Krishna consciousness. And it is explained that he did that to, get past that breaking, with people's guards against it. Oh, okay, now you're starting with the mythology. We don't want to do the So he does that to step over that, to let these people go and actually access what matters is the eternal esoteric meaning of things. So my question is, how far can we go, in our current situation with the current world, what's happening, into presenting these things?
Well, I think we don't really have to go very far in that direction at all. There are, I think, reasonable explanations for everything we say. We don't, and I think what I'm actually seeing in the world around us is that a lot of people have skepticism of a hard-nosed, materialistic, atheistic viewpoint. So you're never going to really be able to convince people who are dyed-in-the-wool atheists, materialists, But people who are not already completely sold on that kind of outlook in life, those people we can reach. And I don't think we need to go so far. Over the years, as the years go on, certain things are starting to lose their chokehold on the culture in general. At one point, people would give a strong argument for Marxism or something like that. People are not so eager to do that anymore. It's hard to defend it. Similarly, that we would find a scientific answer for every question at one point was a real strong mood in the zeitgeist or the worldview at the time. But now I think most people realize that's never going to happen, or at least there's a large amount of people who can understand that we're always going to have partial knowledge. Even scientists talk like that these days, that whatever knowledge we have is only partial knowledge. And tomorrow, we may actually say the opposite thing. So there was a book I recently read called The Half-Life of Facts. The half-life of facts. Facts, yeah. That in modern scientific, or even in academia, you have books being, written and distributed to students in colleges about a particular field of human study. And those books are changing. And they change, and then they change, and then they change again. And what might be in the textbook of 5 years ago will be different in this textbook this year, And so it's reasonable to expect that next, 5 years may have other things. He gives all kinds of examples about this. But at any rate, the point that I'm making is that I think we can be pretty straightforward about most things, again, knowing that some people are never going to accept. But at least if you can give a reasonable, not just it's that way because it's that way, because our scriptures say it. They may say it, but for a lot of other people, that won't do the job. And, I think that at the time of Bhaktivinoda, there was much more of a sense of people looking towards science to be able to explain everything. And now we live in kind of a post-scientific world where we realize science is never going to, do that bill. I mean, some people don't realize that, but at least there's more of a thinking in that way. So, but to say things in a systematic way, in a reasonable way, is, I think, how eventually we'll be able to win over a large segment of the human population. At least, some people are not philosophical or scientific at all, so they won't know the details. But some people who are will eventually, change around, and that will change around some of the others. So, and that's why we have things like the BI now, and we have other groups that are addressing various challenges that are coming our way. So I think that's important. We have to accept and answer various challenges, and I think we can do so reasonably without having to, hide around so much. Also, these days, everything is known on the internet anyway, so there's very little point in trying to pretend that we're something we're not, and I generally don't recommend that approach,
Yeah, this also, I had a feeling like this, so like now the times are not so strict, like anything flies now, basically, and Prabhupada, he felt that, that's why he came as he is, and he presented it as he is, even wore the same cloth, although his godbrothers, we know how that went. They came back wearing the Englishman cloth. So Prabhupada felt that, so that these are the times that are starting, that like actually the more unique you are, even in your appearance, that it may be even more attractive. And like we can see that on the internet, all these like theories fly, even like there's many people that are seriously taking the flat earth, and they're discussing the details and like doing the calculations, everything. So like there's no point in catering to, like if you cater to somebody, basically be some group, but because of this big informational sphere that we are having access to right now, we're so used to it, but it's actually unheard of. I know, were there any time in the past that was like that? Like we know about Sanjaya telling to Dhritarashtra, opening up the scene of the battlefield of Kurukshetra, but now everyone can just do that through these yantras that we carry on our bodies every day and every time, and everyone is connected to that, and it's just like it's fantastic how big of an opportunity that opens for us, and it's kind of sad that not enough devotees realize that and like doing effort. But it's good that it's picking up. What I'm noticing is picking up, and we're presenting these things as they are, and people are taking heed. They're noticing it. But it's a long way to go.
Well, there's a certain very narrow scientific viewpoint that is starting to lose ground, that viewpoint that everything is material, everything can be explained only by material forces, and there's no purpose anywhere, there's no God. This very narrow viewpoint can explain some things, especially those things that are easily controllable and can be measured or investigated through a scientific process. But the rest of the world, it has no grip on, it has no explanation for. We can't explain why we like certain things, why we don't like certain things. We can't explain ethics. Ethics is an important thing in our world. Somebody has to decide what we should do and what we shouldn't do, what's punishable and what's not, And science really doesn't help us with that, this scientific, hard-nosed, very narrow viewpoint doesn't help us with explaining all kinds of strange phenomena that most people at one time in their lives will experience. So what do we do with that? The hard-nosed scientific viewpoint says you just pretend it doesn't exist. But people who've had that happen to them or had that intersect with their lives, they can't pretend it didn't exist because it did happen to them. So, this is the way. Even history, we're starting to realize that there are so many things which don't make sense according to our the history that you and I grew up studying in school. The pyramids were built by Egyptians, with these big pulleys and rolling logs and things like that. It's like millions of tons of stone were moved this way and placed so exactly that our modern buildings in New York City are put to shame by the exactitude with which the stones line up, So somehow an ancient culture was able to do this, but our modern culture is still unable to do it. So there's lots of things like that, which is starting to dissolve, or at least it shows that the world around us is less understood than we tend to make it out to be. And if these mysterious areas are there, are we going to pretend they all don't exist forever, or we're going to investigate them in some kind of way? These are actually investigatable in a scientific way, not maybe in the same way that chemistry is, but we're still able to investigate them in some way, and we can't just shove them under the rug. And I think that that's where there's a good preaching opportunity. All right. Any other questions or comments? All right. So thank you all for hanging on in there. So thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śrimad Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.